I would like to open this event by recognizing that McGill University is on land which long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous people whose presence have enriched this territory on which peoples of the world now gather. Avant de donner le coup d'envoi à cet événement, permettez-moi de souligner que l'Université McGill est située sur un territoire qui a longtemps été un lieu de rencontre et d'échange pour les peuples autochtones, notamment pour les nations Haudenosaunee et Anishinaabe. Nous saluons et remercions les divers peuples autochtones qui ont enrichi de leur présence ce territoire, lequel accueille aujourd'hui des gens de partout dans le monde.
Dear alumni, members of the campus community and friends, welcome to this bicentennial at-home homecoming intergenerational conversation with the faculties of Arts and Law. I'm Robert Leckey, Dean of the Law Faculty, and along with Interim Dean of Arts, Mary Hunter, we will moderate a panel discussion exploring Indigenous rights in Canada and the role that academia can play in informing policies in relation to equity, diversity, and inclusion, often referred to as EDI. Now, I know our McGill audience is all over the world, but we're presenting to you from the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people. And this island has historically been a meeting place for other Indigenous nations, including the Algonquin people. We at the Faculty of Law are engaging in work to allow students from historically underrepresented populations, specifically Black and Indigenous students, to flourish at the faculty. And we acknowledge the ongoing colonization and subjugation of these peoples. The McGill Law community and I acknowledge the reparative work we have to do. And I want to mention that the household of James McGill, whose bequest enabled the founding of this university, included at least 5 enslaved Black and Indigenous persons. And with that, I'm turning the virtual microphone over to my colleague, Interim Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Professor Mary Hunter.
Thank you, Dean Leckey. It's a pleasure to be a part of this important conversation and to co-moderate this remarkable panel discussion. To our esteemed panelists, thank you all for your time and for sharing your invaluable expertise. Equality, diversity, and inclusion are of utmost importance to the Faculty of Arts, and we're grateful for the time you've taken to share your expertise with us. I'm thrilled to have on the panel today Dr. Cindy Blackstock, Executive Director of First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada, Associate Professor and Director of First Nations Children's Action Research and Education Service at the University of Alberta, and Professor in McGill's School of Social Work. Kimberly Lee Lewis, Assistant Dean of Law, who focuses on inclusion, Black and Indigenous flourishing, and also Debra Thompson, Associate Professor of Political Science and Canadian Research Chair in Racial Inequality and in Democratic Societies, also here at McGill. I now turn the virtual microphone over to our esteemed panelists for a brief presentation before we kick off with the Q&A portion of this discussion. Dr. Blackstock, we look forward to hearing from you first.
Thank you. I join you from unceded Algonquin territory here in Ottawa. And tomorrow we will be recognizing as a nation the first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. This comes on the heels of the rediscovery of thousands of children buried in residential school grounds across this country. We're now at about 1,500 children in unmarked graves, and that number will build because there were 139 residential schools and only a handful have done the work to rediscover the kids. The question is, what do we learn from residential schools? In 2019, a legal ruling came down, and it used these terms: willful and reckless discrimination in a worst-case scenario. The tribunal was describing the behavior of the Government of Canada towards this generation of First Nations children. In order to really honor the memories of the children who died in residential schools and those who attended residential schools and told their truths, we must altogether implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls calls to justice, and we must turn our minds to the ongoing injustices, such as the underfunding of federal services for First Nations peoples across this country. The good news for all of us is that many of these challenges have solutions already on the books. What we need to do is ensure that states, universities, and professions and others actually implement these solutions on the ground. And that, of course, includes McGill University. It's not enough to just talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. We have to do the hard work of implementing them by reforming things like making mandatory courses on First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, by recalibrating our tenure and promotion things so that we're actually recognizing service to Indigenous communities, and that we're doing the hard historical work of looking at the role of McGill itself in either being a bystander or being complicit, and also telling the stories of the active resistors to colonialism throughout this time. If that space was created, then we would find more First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples walking through the doors of McGill. It's not enough to put out posters saying we're recruiting Indigenous faculty. We have to create a space that truly welcomes. And in order to do that, we must tell the truth about ourselves, and we must engage in reconciliation. Thank you.
Kimberly, would you like to say your statement?
Thank you. McGill's law faculty have shown signs of efforts at fostering diversity. Within the law faculty, there's the addition of Indigenous legal traditions courses. The admissions process is holistic and takes the whole person into consideration. Inclusion refers to the sense of belonging students may feel in a space. McGill can rise to the challenge in ensuring an inclusive and positive learning environment in a manner consistent with and informed by Indigenous worldviews, as well as enhance the academic experiences of students of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit ancestry. Through the creation of an Indigenous learning space at the Faculty of Law, this can be seen as a demonstration of trying to nurture a learning environment which supports not only the academic well-being of Indigenous students, but their spiritual and emotional well-being. Inclusiveness is a goal, but we are not there yet. These initiatives may encourage relationship building and mutual respect. Equity, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI, is an active process. It is not an event, rather a generational learning process. McGill is a learning community, and each of us, regardless of our title or background, must play a part in EDI. It is not about doing this for Black and Indigenous peoples, but with Black and Indigenous peoples, so that this generation may plant the tree and the next generation may enjoy its shade.
Debra.
Thank you. So in the wake of the 2020 uprisings after the murder of George Floyd, I've been thinking a lot about the relationship between racism and democracy. And in any political science course, you're going to learn that democracy is about competition, participation, and civil and political liberties. But what I would argue is that democracy is actually about winning and losing. So, for example, we know that from lessons from dictatorships around the world that it's not about what winners and losers do when they win or lose elections, but what they do afterwards that really matters. So winners can't bar losers from participating in politics. And we as citizens have to abide by the decisions of elections, even if we don't like the outcome. And even if we have no intention of running for office, our democratic experience is characterized by winning and losing. We have preferences, and sometimes those preferences get written into policy, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes we win, and sometimes we lose. And we're okay with this. We're okay with losing because we know that losing is arbitrary in democracy. There are not supposed to be any systemic winners or losers. And in fact, being a good loser is key to democratic stability. And what the 2020 uprisings have demonstrated, I think, for many of us who haven't thought about this in any sustained way, is that the winning and losing in our societies isn't actually arbitrary, but it is in fact by design. And so maybe some people who hadn't before begun to question the nature of our democracy started to ask a few different questions. So why is it, for example, that our democracy requires the most extraordinary sacrifice from those citizens who are already lacking in power and who are arguably in the worst position to make those sacrifices? Second, why is it that so many white citizens seem unwilling or unable to empathize with Black loss? Is it because they actually want to maintain their privilege, or is it because our experiences are so different that white people literally don't understand what it's like to be Black in this society? Third, can we imagine a state that is not founded on violence? And what would that look like? If we really realize calls to defund or abolish the police, can we imagine a state that is founded on an ethic of care and concern and not the threat of death and destruction? Fourth, at what point is it unethical and undemocratic to expect citizens to peacefully acquiesce to their subjugation? And finally, as James Baldwin once asked, is inclusion into existing political structures worth the price of the ticket?
Thank you very much. Professor Thompson, I now have a question for you. I mean, what role do you think academia can play in informing EDI policies?
I mean, that's the question. So on the one hand, when we think of universities, I think that many of us think of universities as this marketplace of ideas, as the place where research is done and ideas are debated in a space where all are welcome. And so that interpretation of universities would lead us to think of the ways that we have the opportunity here to be at the forefront of discourses and actions around equity, diversity, and inclusion. And certainly in the Faculty of Arts, we've worked hard on creating new initiatives, including a Black Studies working group that I'm chairing, and some work in Indigenous studies as well. And that's really promising. On the other hand, I want to just give a word of caution, because even though universities are these marketplace of ideas, they are also corporations, they are brands, they are incredible bureaucracies. And in many ways, they are the upholders of structures of white supremacy. And so, these two functions of the university exist at the same time in the same space. And so the question is, what kind of university do we want to see? What kind of university do we want to partake in? And how do we, as people who are in the university, but perhaps not of the university, partake in creating, in like a world building exercise where we can imagine something quite different?
No, I completely, I agree with you. I think that is this balance of how do we build an institution and also take part in its critique. I think this is a careful balance that we all will be working on now and into the future. Do any of our panelists have other input on this question?
One of the things I've been thinking about is, when we have academic freedom, what duty do we owe the public? And in terms of McGill, there is a marketplace of ideas, but in terms of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, it's not the absence of solutions that's too often the issue. It is the absence of implementation of the available solutions. I can document the inequalities in First Nations children's public services back to 1907, and the impacts on those children dying at rates as high as 20 to 50% in residential schools from preventable causes. That there is very little record that academia stood up to the plate, even though this was across the national news. Mm-hmm. We have the same problem today. You open up newsletters and newspapers and blogs, and you're seeing about the inequality in First Nations peoples they're experiencing in public services. Tuberculosis rates 100 times the rate up in, for Inuit peoples. The persecution of Métis peoples. It's in front of the front pages, but it has not captured the academic imagination and attention to the scale of the problem. And so if we really want to fulfill our public duty, we have to implement these solutions that are already evidence-based and on the books. And we have to recognize faculty for doing that work. It can't just be about the number of SSHRC grants you get when the solutions are already there. We have to do more than that. And in the case of McGill, I think there's another step it needs to take is for Six Nations of the Grand River. McGill would have gone bankrupt had not a trust from the Six Nations of the Grand River been tapped to be able to keep this institution running. Now, McGill paid that money back, but not to Six Nations, to the government of Canada. And so Six Nations has never seen that money back. So there's pieces of McGill's history that it itself needs to take and reconcile as well.
Turning, Kim, I wonder, in your view, what's the role of community organizations in advancing EDI, whether in partnership with universities or on their own?
Thank you, Dean Leckey, for your question. So I think the role of individuals within faculty and that of community organizations are to engage meaningfully and also purposefully with Indigenous elders, community members, and communities in general. And it's to develop bilateral relationships and listening as well, more than speaking. So it's also, when I say listening, it's about listening to the lived experiences of others, understanding that people are also the experts of their own lives and communities, and to understand also one's social location and to reflect on that in relation to the experiences of others and different perspectives. I think it also means to bridge cultural relationships and to consult meaningfully. And because EDI and all of these initiatives are an integral part of lifelong learning, which McGill prides itself in, it is also about unlearning, learning, and then relearning from each other about the world in which we live in, so that we can hopefully have another generation where we won't need EI, and then EI would just be the norm.
If I could just follow up on that for a moment. I mean, the universities look at their student population, for example, and they're aware that the population of students admitted to McGill is not representative of the general population in the province and the country. Professor Blackstock said a moment ago, just sort of putting posters up is not enough. As we try to bring in different students, to bring in members of groups that historically have not been present at McGill, what's the role of community organizations in helping us do that?
Well, basically through that relationship building where the institutions also could adopt a more horizontal approach when we are engaging with communities. So then when we do have a community engagement, we're listening to them. So on their end, when it comes to the community organizations, they are informing us of what leadership is already there, because there is already work being done in the community that needs to be recognized and acknowledged by these institutions as well. So the agenda is not from a top-down approach, and then also referring to their expertise, which they would be able to share with us. Part of that, for example, would be when we are creating initiatives for our students when it comes to diversity and inclusion, which are also two different things as well. We could have a diverse population, but not necessarily inclusion where the students feel included, reflected in the institution. So community organizations can help inform what needs they see within the communities as well that these students may be coming from, to inform us of how to strategize and also how to build our projects out by being informed from their worldviews and their knowledge.
Other thoughts from the other panelists on the community organization piece?
One thing I can say for First Nations communities that would be helpful, we have so many great graduate students at the master's and PhD level across a whole pile of disciplines. And often they're looking for groups to be able to work with to make a meaningful difference. I would like to see, McGill kind of create an opportunity for community organizations to suggest research questions that would actually be meaningful to them, and then to match them up with a cohort of graduate students that they could work with. That would, I think, help on both ends. It would help really develop a community authorized research objective, and also really give these people a good start in their careers about working respectfully on a community authorized project.
Cindy, can I follow up with that? And what do you think is the role of the individual in advancing EDI?
Well, I think one of the roles of the individual is to self-educate. I grew up I'm First Nations, but I grew up in northern BC, and I remember in the school curriculum, we were taught about the Hudson Bay Company. And the only thing we were told is all First Nations had to do is bring in a bunch of furs and you got all this cool stuff in return. And really that was the whole theme of colonialism. What we can't do is just wait for people to teach us or wait for change. We have to involve ourselves in our own self-education. And I would say that's true of many faculty who also had this education, but not the benefit of being a First Nations person themselves. And so be proactive. There are a lot of great resources out there. Films by Elaniso Bomsawin at the National Film Board. There are resources like the National Center on Truth and Reconciliation. From a legal piece, I recommend everybody just get on Google and look at the Indian Act. We have a race-based act in this country that applies to First Nations. It regulates almost every aspect of our lives, including who we can will our property to. So it's important that people look at these things as part of their own self-education. And then to do more than that, it's not enough to know, you have to do something. And on that front, there are the TRC's calls to action, the Murder of Missing Women and Indigenous Girls calls to justice, as well as even at the Caring Society, we have 7 free ways to make a difference in under 2 minutes. So everyone can do it. And I hope everybody, when they had candidates knocking at their door in the last election, asked them what they had personally done for the TRC's calls to action. That when governments hear from all of us, then we can all make a change.
Thank you. Do the other panelists want to weigh in on this question about the individual?
I mean, I think that's been the question that many people have asked, like, what can I do? How can I make a difference? And self-education is certainly important, but as Dr. Blackstock mentioned, it's certainly not enough. It's really hard, right? Because we are combating systems and structures that have been in place for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so it's overwhelming to think about the ways in which, me in my Montreal apartment can possibly battle white supremacy. And yet we've seen, I think, over the past year and more, that what can happen with a critical mass, right? What can happen when we form diverse coalitions that are oriented toward substantive and meaningful change. These structures are formidable, but they have fallen before and they can fall again.
I think this is, to all the panelists, but what do you see the role of social media playing in all of these debates? I know it's changed quite a bit over the last few years, but how important do you think that is? We start with Cindy.
Social media can be a sword and a shield. One of the things I do is I actually actively follow social justice advocates from around the world so I can learn from these people. It is a great place for intentional learning you can follow these exemplars of various different movements around the world and around the globe. Also research institutions and other types of things to inform yourself. The other way it's a great thing is if you have a clear call to action, you can really just disseminate that. I use Twitter. I've got about 60,000 followers, which isn't a lot compared to others, but it's a way of being able to get the word out to people on a regular basis and keep the information going. The other thing I've done is I've done Twitter learning series, where every day I will post a tweet about a particular area. So I did the colonial rule of law, for example, that talked about how colonialism is embedded into Canadian law. I did one on, is it genocide? Talking about the controversy that arose from the murder of missing Indigenous women and girls, where people are saying, well, it's not genocide, and went through that on the Daily Historical Post. So there's ways of using social media in a positive way. The thing that you need to do, though, is check out the credibility of the sources you're retweeting. And don't be part of the problem of sending out false information. That is really, really critical in this age. But I use it a lot.
If I could jump in, we would not have seen the rebellions of 2020 without social media. We wouldn't have seen the emergence of Black Lives Matter in 2014 and the years following without social media. It's been crucial in mobilizing Black people and our allies. And it's been crucial in allowing a broader slice of the population to bear witness to what has always happened. So let's just be clear that the police have always disproportionately killed Black people and harmed us in far greater numbers than the white population. But the video of George Floyd being publicly lynched in the year 2020 was pretty incontrovertible. And so the ability to allow more people to see what we have always known has been incredibly powerful. And yet, social media has its downsides. It is just the tip of the iceberg. Police brutality, police killings are just a tip of the iceberg of an incredibly, incredibly racist criminal punishment system. I don't even call it a criminal justice system because there's very little justice being done. If we want to look at some of the harms that are being done, we need to think about administrative fees that people are forced to pay to engage with the criminal punishment system, the lack of adequate representation in many cases. And so, we have to be careful because social media tends to focus on that which is spectacular, and that which is a spectacle. And there's so much more to like the entrenched nature of racism than what we notice. The other danger of social media, even as it's a force of mobilization, is that our public beefs in mobilizing in social mobilization get kind of play out in a public sphere, and it enables a kind of critique of the movement when previously I think some of those disagreements might have been hidden from public view. And yet, debate, discourse, like this is part of movement building. There's going to be contention, there's going to be arguments. And the fact that they're playing out now in a very public sphere, I think has enabled a lot of the critics of the movement to point fingers and say, well, look, Black people don't even know what they want. And yet that is, again, a strategy that's very, very familiar to us and has played out in various ways before.
I'm wondering, there's a sense that social media can allow people to get a message out, but it also makes one is visible and ripe for attack by people who disagree. And certainly some of the things I read suggest that women, racialized women, are particularly likely to be the recipients of vitriol and extreme and violent hatred. Are there things that the university can better do to support its members who are speaking up and disseminating knowledge and trying to move things on these fronts?
I think I stand in the winds of Canada's discrimination on kind of a daily basis. I'm on social media a lot. I've learned how to kind of curate some of these tweets and when to respond and when not to. And I always do so as much as I can with evidence. I think one of the things that McGill needs to kind of think about is just personal security, though. By having our emails and out on, when we're a public persona, up on websites, etc., it's sometimes we get emails and mail that is pretty inappropriate. And so I think that there might be some thinking about how to kind of respect people's privacy when you're that much in the public light in these areas that ought not be controversial, but are, because we're standing in the winds of discrimination. So that would be my recommendation for the university.
I'm part of a working group of the Royal Society of Canada about academic freedom. And one of the things we've heard is that the universities are maybe stuck in a model of sort of security threats of a couple of decades ago, where you write to security and you say, I'm getting these threats. And they say, well, keep a log of what you're getting. And that might be appropriate if one person is threatening you. But, if thousands of people are writing hateful messages about you on social media, you probably shouldn't be the one to be logging that. And it's not clear what you would do with that log if you had it. So we probably need to catch up a little bit. Are institutional accounts a better way for people to be communicating than their own personal Twitter or personal emails, things like that?
I don't think it really matters. You can block on Twitter. I think having good education about how to use social media and how to kind of deal with, for example, QAnon, etc.
Yeah.
I think that this is a new reality on a broad movement. There's something called movement jacking, where state parties and other actors will actually try to hijack movements for their own particular causes. And that goes for academics as well. And so having a bit more fluency on how to deal with social media, and then for institutions to provide a bunch of options to people so that they can pick the most secure choice for themselves. I think just the downside is for anybody on the internet to know where you work, what your office number, phone number is not always a helpful thing.
Yeah, if I could jump in, I mean, I think that this is a really interesting conversation. And I think that, to me, it speaks to what internal policies McGill has to protect faculty, to protect our students, and not just that, but to think about, we've been talking about EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and we think about those initiatives as being separate from workload issues, but they're actually not, right? Like at one point, I was at a conference and I was telling my colleagues what I have to do to keep myself safe in institutional environments like this. I have a panic button in my office. I know because if I'm in a classroom where I'm teaching and a student threatens me, I know that campus police is not a great option for me. So I do a lot of things that are necessary for me as a Black woman to keep myself safe that my white male colleagues don't have to do. And that's not even like to scratch the surface of the excess mentoring I do, the students that are frequently lined up outside my door during office hours because there's no one else who looks like them in this institution, right? And so to think about like these issues as workload issues, right? Like that this should be tabulated into the idea of what labor I have to put forward to do my job. And the fact that I am working more on these very, very basic security issues than some of my other colleagues. Like this needs to, if we're really serious about the idea of equity, then that's part of it.
No, I think so too. One of the things I've been hopeful in seeing is also the way in which we're addressing those workload issues and also linking them to administrative service, to research, because sometimes the research is so closely connected to that mentoring work that is so crucial and important to all of our students and to other faculty as well.
I think that the panelists have done an extraordinary job at moving between big ideas, justice and justice, but also very concrete things. And as we wrap up the conversation, I hope that the three of you, in the order of Debra Thompson, Kimberly Lewis, and then Cindy Blackstock, could just identify a single urgent but identifiable action item, something where we could say, yeah, that's actually been acted on, that you think would further advance justice and inclusion.
So I'm obviously biased, but we need Black Studies at McGill. I think there's been a huge demand for it. We are working towards it. There have been demands at this university for Black Studies since the 90s, and it's time to get it done.
I believe also by jostling the dominant voice. So going back to the idea of inclusion. So by creating space for multiple identities, amplifying diverse voices, and also identifying structural barriers and removing them.
Thank you.
I go back to the TRC's calls to action and also the important recognition that this is Haudenosaunee territory. I think sometimes there's an overuse of the word Indigenous. There are specific things that affect First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples that do not, that are distinct to those populations. And we ought to really honor that and also just really pay our respects and have a good relationship with the host territory.
I'd like to thank the panel today for your insightful comments and critiques. It is clear that we all still have a lot of work to do, but I'm hopeful, thanks to your research and to your invaluable contributions to both McGill and to the wider community. So thank you everyone for taking part today.